The air was heavy with the sound of the city, cars passing by, distant conversations, and the low hum of people going about their lives. The FBI chief, dressed in his usual attire, stepped out of the diner, the smell of coffee and freshly cooked eggs lingering on his clothes. He had just finished a quick breakfast during a break in his busy schedule. The sun was just rising, casting an early morning glow over the streets. His mind was already working through the day ahead, meetings, updates, and cases that required his attention. He had been traveling for hours, and the weight of the day was starting to wear on him. As he reached his car, ready to leave the quiet neighborhood and head to his next destination, he noticed a patrol car parked nearby. 2 officers were standing beside it, their uniforms crisp and their faces serious. He didn't think much of it at first, just another routine interaction, he assumed. He walked to his car and unlocked it, but before he could get in, the officers approached. "Sir, can I have a moment?" One of the officers called out, his voice a bit too firm. The FBI chief turned, raising an eyebrow. "Of course. What's the issue?" One officer stepped closer, his tone still rigid. "You were just seen leaving the diner, and we need to ask you a few questions about your vehicle." There was something off about the way he said it, a certain coldness that didn't sit well with the chief. The chief's hand instinctively went to his badge. "I'm afraid you have me mistaken. I haven't done anything wrong. You can check my car if you like." The officers exchanged a look, and for a brief moment the chief felt something shift in the air. They didn't look like they were interested in helping or clearing things up. Instead, it seemed as if they were waiting for something, maybe a chance to prove their authority or to see how far they could push him. "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" the officer asked, his voice suddenly more aggressive. The chief was taken aback but remained calm. "I'm not sure why you'd need to search my car. If you suspect something, I'm happy to give you my ID. You know who I am." At that, the officer's attitude shifted even more. He looked at the chief with disdain, then scoffed. "You're one of those, aren't you? Acting all important." The words hit the chief like a slap. He had dealt with arrogance before, but this was different. There was a racial undertone to the officer's words. He could feel his blood begin to boil, but he kept his composure, unwilling to let his emotions take control. The second officer, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward. "We're just doing our job, sir. No need to make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult," the chief replied, keeping his voice even. "I just want to understand why I'm being treated this way when I've done nothing wrong." The officers didn't answer right away. Instead, they took a step closer, their bodies becoming more imposing. The chief felt the tension rising between them. He could tell they were looking for an excuse, any excuse, to escalate things. "You think you're above the law, huh?" One of the officers sneered, his tone mocking. The chief's heart began to race. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. These officers weren't just doing their jobs, they were looking for an opportunity to make him submit, to put him in his place. The thought disgusted him. He had devoted his life to upholding the law, to ensuring justice for everyone, and now here he was, being bullied by 2 officers who seemed to think they were above it. "I think you've got the wrong idea," the chief said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside him. "I've been nothing but cooperative. You're the ones who are making this a problem." The officers didn't seem to care about his reasoning. Instead, they began making demands. They told him to step out of the car. The chief hesitated for a moment, trying to figure out if there was any way to defuse the situation. But it was clear they weren't going to let him go without making things worse. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle. As soon as his feet hit the ground, one of the officers roughly grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "You're under arrest," the officer barked. The chief's mind reeled in disbelief. "Arrest for what? Wait, what am I being arrested for?" the chief demanded, his voice rising now in frustration. "I've done nothing wrong. You can't just arrest me like this." The officer didn't respond, only tightening his grip on the chief's arm as the other officer started to search the car. The chief's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. These officers were making a mockery of the law, and he was at their mercy. He knew he couldn't afford to let them get away with this. He had to stay calm, but the humiliation was unbearable. The idea of being treated like this just because of the color of his skin made him feel small. But he refused to show weakness. He wouldn't let them see how much this was affecting him. "Is there a reason I'm being treated like a criminal?" the chief asked, his voice quieter now but still firm. One of the officers sneered at him. "You're just like all the others, aren't you? Think you can walk around, flash your badge, and get away with anything?" The words stung, but the chief held his ground. He knew these officers had crossed a line, and they knew it too. But they weren't stopping. They were only pushing harder. The chief took a deep breath and reminded himself of his training. He had been in tough situations before. He had faced danger from all kinds of people. But he had always found a way out. This wasn't any different. He had to think. As the second officer continued his search, the chief's mind raced. He knew he needed to get out of this. He needed to find a way to defuse the situation before things escalated any further. "Let me speak to your supervisor," the chief said, his tone steady. "You're making a mistake, and I'd like to resolve this without further issues." But the officers didn't listen. Instead, they laughed, ignoring his request. "You think we need permission to arrest you?" one officer mocked. "You're not special." The chief's pulse quickened. This was no longer just about a simple misunderstanding. This was about power, control, and racism. They weren't arresting him for anything legitimate. They were doing it because they could, and he could feel the weight of their prejudice pressing down on him. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden realization. These officers weren't interested in resolving this. They wanted to break him, to make him feel powerless. He could sense the danger. He needed to act, and fast. The more he resisted, the more they seemed to enjoy it. He had to figure out a way to turn the tables before this got worse. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. The FBI chief, his hands still cuffed behind his back, felt the officer's grip tighten as they marched him toward the police car. His mind was racing. How had things escalated this quickly? He'd been a law enforcement officer for years, and in all that time he had never imagined himself in this kind of situation. Yet here he was, powerless in the hands of two officers who had crossed a line. As they shoved him into the back of the patrol car, the chief could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had to stay calm. He had to think clearly. Panicking would only make things worse. But it wasn't easy. The anger inside him bubbled up, and every part of him wanted to lash out. The officers climbed into the front of the car, and for a moment, there was only silence. The sound of the engine starting broke the stillness, and the car began to move. The chief's mind was still spinning, trying to figure out what he could do next. He needed to get out of this situation, and fast. But how? He could tell the officers were enjoying this. The smug look on their faces as they drove away told him they thought they had won. They were in control now, and that realization made his blood run cold. One of the officers, the one who had been the most aggressive, turned around in his seat and smirked at the chief. "You know, it's not every day we get to arrest someone like you," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I bet you never thought this would happen to you, did you?" The chief's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He refused to give the officer the satisfaction of seeing him angry or upset. Instead, he focused on keeping his breathing steady, on staying in control. His training had prepared him for difficult situations, but this was different, the officer continued. "You think your badge means anything here? You think you can just walk around, flash it, and expect to be treated differently? You're no better than anyone else. In fact, you're probably worse." The words hit harder than the chief expected. He had heard insults before, but there was something particularly stinging about the officer's words. They weren't just attacking him. They were attacking everything he stood for. All the work, all the sacrifices he had made throughout his career were being belittled in an instant. But he wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. He wouldn't give them that power. The car drove on, the city streets blurring by as the officer's words hung in the air. The chief's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. The longer he stayed quiet, the more the officers seemed to think they had control over him. They were clearly enjoying the power they held, but what they didn't realize was that he wasn't like the people they typically pushed around. He wasn't someone they could easily intimidate. He had spent years in law enforcement, and he knew the system better than anyone. He knew how to turn the tables. He just needed the right moment. The second officer, who had been mostly silent up until now, spoke up. "Hey man, don't you think we've gone a little too far? This isn't exactly by the book." His voice wasn't as confident as the first officer's, it was almost uncertain. The chief could hear the hesitation, and for a brief moment he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to get through to him. The first officer shot him a glare. "You're too soft," he snapped. We're doing what we need to do. He thinks he's better than us. We need to put him in his place." The chief's mind was working fast. He had to figure out how to use this moment. The officer's words had given him a clue. There was a crack in their confidence. The second officer wasn't as sure of himself, and that was something he could use. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice calm and controlled. "You know, you don't have to do this. You don't have to let your partner drag you down into this mess. I'm sure you've got better things to do than harass an innocent man." The second officer didn't respond at first, but the chief could see his eyes flicker to the rearview mirror, as if considering his words. "Maybe you're right," the officer said quietly. "Maybe this is a little much." The chief seized the opportunity. "I know you're just following orders, but this isn't the way things are supposed to work. You don't have to go along with this. You don't have to be part of this corruption." For a brief moment, it looked like the officer was going to say something else. But then the first officer interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "Stop talking! Just shut up, all right?" The car swerved slightly as the officer slammed his hand on the steering wheel. The second officer flinched, and the chief could tell the tension was reaching a breaking point. He had to be careful. Pushing too hard could make things worse, but if he didn't try, they'd keep going with this ridiculous arrest. As they drove deeper into the city, the chief felt his options narrowing. He had to get out of this. He couldn't let them just drag him away and make up some ridiculous charges. He needed to get the message across to make them see that they couldn't just push him around. "I'm not your enemy," the chief said, his voice steady. "I'm just trying to do my job just like you. You're making a mistake. This is all wrong." The first officer ignored him, focusing instead on the road ahead. But the second officer, the one who seemed less certain, glanced back at him. "I didn't want to arrest you," he said quietly. "I don't know why he's doing this, I don't know." The chief took this as a sign. It was his chance. "You don't have to be part of this. You can stop it. You can still make things right." But the first officer shot a look over his shoulder. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to get inside your head." The second officer looked torn, his eyes flickering between the road and the chief. The tension in the car was palpable now. The chief could see the cracks in their facade. He wasn't powerless. He had more control than they realized. The patrol car finally came to a stop in a secluded area, far from the usual hustle and bustle of the city. The officers got out of the car, pulling the chief along with them. He didn't resist. He needed to stay calm. If he fought back, it would only make things worse. As they walked toward a small, run-down building, the first officer spoke again, his tone much harsher now. "This is your last chance, Chief. We're in control here. Don't think for a second you can get out of this." The chief glanced around looking for any opportunity, but there was nothing. He was alone with them in a place where no one could hear him. He took a deep breath and steeled himself. This wasn't over. He wasn't going to let them break him. He wasn't going to let them get away with this, and in that moment he knew he had to act fast. Time was running out. The chief's mind raced as he was pushed along by the officers. He could feel the cold air biting at his skin, the smell of metal and dust in the air as they led him deeper into the desolate area. Every step they took seemed to echo in the empty space around them, the sound of their boots on the cracked pavement ringing out like a warning. It felt as if the walls were closing in. He didn't know where they were taking him, but he knew it wasn't good. The small part of his mind that wasn't consumed with panic told him that this place wasn't just an ordinary police station or holding area. It felt too secluded, too out of the way. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This was personal, and it terrified him. The officers were still talking, but the chief had stopped listening. Their words were a blur now. As he focused on every possible escape route in his mind, he scanned the area around him, looking for something, anything that might give him a chance to break free. But there was nothing. Just the cold, quiet space and the officers who seemed intent on making him suffer. When they reached the small building, the first officer swung open a rusted door, revealing a dimly lit room. It smelled of old wood and stale air, the kind of place that hadn't seen proper care in years. The second officer pushed the chief inside with a rough shove, and the door slammed shut behind him. "Sit down," the first officer growled, motioning to a rickety wooden chair in the center of the room. The chief hesitated, but one of the officers jabbed him in the back, urging him forward. His hands were still bound by the cuffs and his body ached from the rough handling. He had no choice but to sit. He wasn't sure how long they stood there watching him, but it felt like an eternity. The silence was oppressive, the only sound coming from the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet. He knew they were waiting for something, maybe for him to break, to beg for mercy, but he wasn't going to do that. Not for them. The first officer finally spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You think you're better than us, don't you? You think you can just walk around in your fancy suit and flash your badge like it means something? Well, it doesn't, not here, not now." The chief looked up, his gaze steady. "I never said I was better than anyone, but I do believe in the law. I believe in justice. And what you're doing right now, isn't it?" The officer laughed, the sound bitter and mocking. "Justice? You want to talk about justice? You're no better than the criminals you lock up. You just wear a badge and call it doing the right thing. But it's all the same. You think you're above it all, but you're not. You're just a man like any other. And right now you're our prisoner." The words stung, but the chief didn't flinch. He had heard worse from people who had no idea what real power meant. These officers, desperate to prove something, had no understanding of what it took to truly serve justice. He didn't need to explain that to them. He didn't need to justify his choices. They would see eventually. "You're making a mistake," the chief said quietly, his voice calm. "You don't want to do this. Whatever it is you think you're getting out of this, it's not worth it." The second officer shifted uncomfortably. The chief could see the doubt in his eyes, the hesitation that hadn't been there before. But the first officer wasn't having any of it. He slammed his fist down on the nearby table, making the chief jump. "Enough of your lectures. You think you're going to talk your way out of this? You're just a prisoner now. You're nothing. You're going to regret thinking you could come here and tell us how to do our jobs." The words hit hard, but the chief refused to react. He didn't need to. He knew that the longer he stayed calm, the more it would break them down. They were the ones in control, but they were also losing control. The more desperate they got, the more they revealed their weaknesses. The second officer's voice trembled. "I didn't think it was going to be like this. We were just supposed to, keep him here until we figured out what to do. I didn't think we'd be doing this." The first officer shot him a sharp look. "You think he's going to make you feel sorry for him? Don't listen to him. He's just trying to get inside your head." But it was too late. The second officer's gaze flickered back to the chief. There was a crack in his demeanor now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. The chief saw it, and in that moment he knew he had to seize this opportunity. "Listen to me," the chief said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to keep going down this path. You know what's wrong and you can stop it. It's not too late. You can make it right." The first officer was growing more agitated, but the second officer looked lost, unsure of what to do next. His hands were shaking as he looked from the chief to his partner, torn between loyalty and doubt. The chief leaned forward in his chair, his gaze fixed on the second officer. "You can walk away from this. You can stop it right now. You know this isn't the right thing to do. You know it." The second officer hesitated, his eyes flicking to the first officer, who was now glaring at him, urging him to stay focused. But it was clear that the second officer's resolve was weakening. He was no longer sure of himself. He had been complicit in this from the beginning, but he had no idea how to fix it. The chief could see that the doubt in the second officer's eyes was growing. The seed had been planted. He just needed to keep pushing. "You've got a choice," the chief continued. "You don't have to be part of this. You can walk away and we can all go back to our lives. But if you keep going down this path, it won't end well. You know that." The second officer opened his mouth as if he was about to speak, but the first officer cut him off, his voice booming with anger. "Stop, just stop. He's trying to manipulate you." "He's a liar. Don't listen to him." The tension in the room was thick. The first officer was practically spitting with rage now, while the second officer was still silent, his face pale, his hands trembling. The chief knew that time was running out. He had to make his move. "Do what's right," the chief said, his voice steady. "You know what needs to be done. You can end this. Right now." For a moment there was nothing but silence. The chief's heart was pounding in his chest as he waited, hoping that the second officer would make the right choice. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he had to trust that the officer's conscience would win out. The second officer took a step back, his eyes locked on the chief. I can't do this. I can't keep going with this. The first officer spun around, his eyes wild with anger. What did you say? You're going to let him walk, after everything we've done? But the second officer didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the chief alone with the first officer. The door slammed behind him, and for a moment everything was still. The chief was breathing heavily, but he didn't let himself relax. This was far from over, but he had just won a small victory. The first officer stood motionless, staring at the door that had just closed behind his partner. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning unit in the corner. The chief could feel the heavy weight of the officer's gaze on him. It was a look that suggested the officer was trying to figure out his next move, and the chief had no illusions about what that might be. He wasn't done yet. The officer was still dangerous, still desperate to prove his authority. For a moment, there was no sound except for the rustling of the officer's uniform as he took a step forward. The chief could feel his pulse quicken, the anticipation thick in the air. He knew this was his chance to take control of the situation. The officer, though, was not someone who was easily swayed. His face was hard, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of frustration and rage. The chief sat still, his body stiff from the handcuffs that dug into his wrists. He had been sitting in this rickety chair for what felt like hours, but he wasn't going to let it break him. The more he stayed calm, the more the officer's impatience seemed to grow, and that was exactly what he needed. "Why don't you just admit it?" the officer finally growled. His voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. "You think you can outsmart me? But you're just a man, just like anyone else. You're not untouchable." The chief looked up at him, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not trying to outsmart anyone. I'm trying to make sure that justice is served." "This isn't the way to do it." The officer let out a derisive snort. "Justice? You want to talk about justice while you're sitting there, pretending you're better than everyone else? You're nothing but a hypocrite." The chief remained quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about how to respond. The officer's words were like a needle trying to provoke him, trying to force him into a reaction. But he wasn't going to fall for it. He knew that the more he stayed calm, the more the officer would unravel. "I'm not better than anyone," the chief said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "But I do know right from wrong. And this isn't right," the officer scoffed, pacing back and forth in front of the chief. "You're so high and mighty, aren't you? You think you've got the moral high ground? Well, let me tell you something. People like you, people in your position, they've always looked down on people like me. You think you're better, you think you're above us, and you know what? Maybe you are, but not anymore." The chief's heart sank. It wasn't just anger in the officer's voice, it was something deeper, something more dangerous. This wasn't just about an arrest. This was about power. The officer wasn't just angry about the situation. He was angry at the system, at everything he thought the chief represented. And right now that made him more dangerous than anything else. "Listen," the chief began, his voice softer now. "I understand you're frustrated, but what you're doing, this isn't going to fix anything. It's only going to make things worse. I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to do what's right." The officer stopped pacing and turned to face him, his eyes wild. "You think you can talk your way out of this, huh? You think you're special because you wear a badge? Well, you're not. You're just a prisoner like everyone else." The words stung more than the chief wanted to admit, but he refused to let the officer see his reaction. He couldn't let this officer break him, not when he had come so far. "You're not in control here," the chief said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "You think you are, but you're not. You're losing control and you know it." The officer's face twisted with rage. For a moment it seemed like he might explode, but instead he just stood there, fists clenched, breathing heavily. It was as if the words were hitting him harder than anything the chief could do. "Don't tell me what I know," the officer spat. "I'm in control here. And if you don't shut up, you'll regret it." The chief didn't flinch. He didn't show fear. "You can threaten me all you want, but it's not going to change the truth. You're scared. You're scared of what's happening to you, to your job, to your future, and that's why you're doing this." The officer froze. For a moment, the chief thought he might have broken through to him. But then the officer's face hardened again, and he took a step closer, towering over the chief. "You have no idea what you're talking about," the officer snarled. "You think you can talk me down, but you're wrong. You have no power here. I do. The chief's mind raced. This was it. This was the moment where things would either get better or spiral out of control. He couldn't let this officer's anger dictate what happened next. He needed to make one last attempt to de-escalate the situation, to show the officer that there was still time to turn things around. Listen, the chief said, his voice softer now. I'm not trying to fight you. I'm trying to get through to you. We both know this isn't who you are. You're just caught up in something you don't fully understand. The officer's hands twitched, like he was about to strike, but he didn't. The tension in the room was unbearable, and the chief knew that every second counted. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. Both men froze. The officer glanced toward the door, his face briefly flickering with confusion before he turned back to the chief. Stay here, the officer growled, his voice low. Don't move. He walked toward the door and the chief could hear the muttering of voices outside. For a moment, there was a strange sense of relief in the air. The officer opened the door and a few seconds later, another officer entered the room. This officer, a taller man with a more measured expression, scanned the room briefly before fixing his gaze on the first officer. What's going on in here? The new officer asked, his tone professional but with a hint of concern. The first officer was momentarily taken aback, clearly not expecting anyone else. Just keeping an eye on him, he said, trying to sound casual. Making sure he doesn't try anything funny. The taller officer didn't look convinced. His eyes flicked to the chief, who was still sitting in the chair, his arms bound. The chief could tell that this officer wasn't as ready to engage in whatever this was turning into. His gaze softened slightly when he saw the chief, but he quickly masked it with a professional demeanor. You need to calm down, the taller officer said, his voice more authoritative. This isn't the way to handle things, the first officer growled in frustration. I've got this under control. You don't need to interfere. The taller officer raised an eyebrow. I'm not interfering. I'm telling you that this could end badly if you don't back off. The chief felt a flicker of hope. The officer had just given him the opportunity he needed to speak, to make his case. The air seemed to shift slightly as the tension grew thicker. The chief knew that if he could keep his composure just a little longer, he might be able to change the course of the situation. I don't want any trouble, the chief said quietly, his voice steady. I just want to make sure that we're all doing the right thing. The taller officer looked at him for a long moment. And for the first time since the ordeal began, the chief saw a flicker of understanding in the officer's eyes. It was small, but it was there. The doubt, the hesitation. He could see it now in the way the officer shifted his weight and the way his gaze softened just a little. But before the moment could grow, the first officer snapped. Enough talking. Get out of here, he yelled at the new officer, his voice full of anger. The taller officer didn't flinch, but he didn't push either. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room without saying another word. The first officer was left standing, furious. But for a fleeting moment, the chief saw the first officer's anger falter. Something had changed. The room felt heavier now, the air thicker with the lingering silence. The chief remained seated, his body aching from the tension, his arms still bound behind the chair. He could feel the weight of every minute that passed, each second dragging on as the officers, especially the first one, seemed to hover between aggression and indecision. But there was a noticeable change in the air now, a shift. The first officer wasn't as certain as before. He seemed unsettled, his earlier fury replaced by something more complicated. Doubt. The chief had noticed it, but he didn't want to rush it. He couldn't. The opportunity to talk his way out of this wasn't over yet, but he had to be careful. The first officer was still dangerous, and the situation could easily spiral again if the wrong words were said. The door creaked open again, and the tall officer from earlier stepped back into the room. His eyes swept over the scene quickly before he looked at the chief, offering a faint nod as if acknowledging the tension. I need to speak to you outside, the tall officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. The first officer didn't speak, but his eyes narrowed suspiciously. It was clear he wasn't thrilled about the idea of anyone stepping in. But for whatever reason, he didn't protest. The chief's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had something changed? Why was this officer taking charge? What did he want? The tall officer motioned for the chief to stand, his eyes softening ever so slightly. I'm not here to make this worse. I just need to make sure things are handled properly. The first officer grunted and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as if to show he wasn't pleased. This guy's a piece of work. You can't just let him walk out of here. The tall officer didn't even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on the chief. We'll talk outside, he repeated, his voice a bit more insistent now. The chief nodded slowly, not sure what the officer wanted from him, but willing to take the chance. He rose carefully from the chair, his legs stiff from sitting for so long, and was led toward the door by the tall officer. Once they were outside, away from the confines of the room, the cool air of the evening hit the chief's face like a shock. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a brief sense of freedom, as if the weight of the room had been lifted from his shoulders. They stepped out into a narrow hallway. The dim light above flickered, casting shadows along the walls. The tall officer didn't say anything at first, and the chief waited, unsure of what was coming next. Finally, the officer spoke. I'm not sure what's going on in there, he said quietly. But I know this. Things can't go on like this. I can see the truth in your eyes. The chief's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. He had been prepared to fight, to try to talk his way out of this with sheer determination. But here was someone who seemed willing to listen. You've got a lot of questions, don't you? The tall officer continued, his voice soft but not dismissive. I know what it's like to feel trapped. To feel like your hands are tied. The chief nodded slowly, a sense of cautious hope flickering inside him. I just want to make sure what's happening here is right, he said quietly. I've spent my whole life fighting for justice. This isn't justice. The officer paused. I know, that's why I wanted to talk to you. I've seen things go wrong, but I'm not the kind of person who stands by and lets it happen. Not anymore. For a moment, the chief didn't know how to respond. The weight of the situation was heavy, and the truth of the officer's words landed in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just about his own fate anymore. It was about the bigger picture. If this officer could help him now, maybe there was hope. The tall officer glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. I've been in this job long enough to know when things aren't right. I see it just like you do, but right now we can't just leave it to chance. We have to make sure it stops here. The chief felt his pulse quicken. What are you suggesting? The officer's gaze hardened. I'm suggesting that we don't let this go any further. You don't deserve to be treated like this. But it's not just you. It's about what happens when people in power abuse it. What happens when they think they're untouchable? I've seen it before, and I don't want to be part of that anymore. There was a long pause. The chief's mind raced, trying to piece together the officer's words. You're telling me you can help me? You can stop this? The officer nodded. But it's not just about you. I need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We need to expose this. We need to take action before things get worse. The chief let out a breath, his shoulders sagging slightly in relief. I can't do this alone. If you're willing to help me, I don't have much choice but to trust you. You're not alone, the officer said firmly. I'm with you, but we need to move fast. I'll make sure we have a way to prove what's happening here, but you need to stay calm. Don't let them see that they've rattled you. The chief looked the officer in the eye. I've spent years trying to do the right thing, trying to bring justice to those who don't have a voice. I'm not going to stop now, the officer nodded. We'll do this together. Just as the chief felt a glimmer of hope, a shout echoed down the hallway. The first officer appeared, looking furious. He had clearly noticed the exchange between the chief and the tall officer. You think you can just walk away from this? The first officer shouted, his voice rising with anger. You think I'm going to let you go? The chief's heart dropped. This wasn't over yet. The first officer's rage had been simmering beneath the surface, and now it was boiling over. The tall officer stepped in front of the chief, his posture defensive but composed. This isn't the way, man, the tall officer said, his voice steady. You're making a mistake. You're letting your anger control you, and it's not going to end well. The first officer sneered. I'm not letting anyone walk out of here. Not after everything we've done. Not after what he's done. The chief stepped forward, his voice firm. It's not too late. You can still stop. You can still do the right thing. You don't have to go down this road. For a moment, the first officer faltered. The anger that had been radiating off him wavered, and the chief saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was only for a second, but it was enough. "You're not too late," the tall officer added. "But you're close. You need to choose what kind of man you want to be. Do you want to be part of the problem or part of the solution?" The first officer clenched his fists, his face red with fury. "I don't need to hear this," he muttered under his breath. The tension in the hallway was palpable. The chief stood his ground, hoping that whatever small shift had occurred in the first officer's mind would be enough. And as the first officer slowly backed away, still muttering angrily to himself, the chief realized that just maybe there was a chance for something to change. "Get out of here," the first officer spat, his voice still filled with venom, but his earlier rage now tempered by doubt. The chief didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence, the steadiness of his presence, said everything. The tall officer gave the chief a brief nod, signaling that it was time to go. The chief followed him out, the sense of something larger, something more important, pushing him forward. He wasn't just walking away. He was standing for something. And that, more than anything, was worth the fight. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the chief felt the weight of the world shift just a little bit. This wasn't the end, but it was a new beginning. The air outside felt different. It was still the same night, the same world, but everything had shifted somehow. The chief walked alongside the tall officer, the weight of everything that had happened still heavy on his shoulders. But now there was a sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope. It wasn't over yet, but at least now, he didn't feel so alone. As they walked through the empty streets, the tall officer kept his eyes peeled, clearly on high alert. The chief knew better than to ask questions at this point. He could sense that things were still far from settled. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. "You know," the officer said quietly, his voice low, "it's never easy. Doing the right thing when you're outnumbered, out of options, it can break a person." The chief glanced at him. The officer's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of experience. This wasn't the first time the officer had been in a situation like this, though it was obvious that this was the first time he had taken a stand in such a bold way. "I've spent a long time trying to stay on the right side of things," the chief replied. "But sometimes the lines get blurry. The system gets twisted and you find yourself in a place where everything you believed in doesn't seem to matter anymore." The officer nodded, his face hardening. "I know the feeling. The job gets to you, wears you down until it feels like there's no way out. You just do what you're told, play the game, and ignore the rest. But eventually you wake up. You realize that something needs to change." The chief let out a breath, the weight of those words sinking in. This officer wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the system, but he had chosen to fight for what was right, and that made all the difference. As they continued walking, the sound of distant sirens echoed in the night, reminding them that they were far from being in the clear. They could be walking into a trap, or worse, the beginning of a much larger fight. The chief had no illusions about how dangerous this situation was, but he couldn't back down now. "I don't know how much time we have," the chief said, his voice low. "We need to move quickly if we're going to do anything about this. The longer we wait, the more likely they'll cover their tracks." The officer looked at him, his gaze steady. "I agree, but we have to be careful. We don't know who's involved in this. You're not the only target here." That was the part the chief hadn't fully processed yet. He had been so focused on his own situation that he hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture. The officers who had arrested him weren't acting on their own. Someone else was pulling the strings, and that person, or those people, were still out there, still in control. "We need a plan," the chief said, his voice firm. "We can't do this blindly. We need to expose them. Take them down before they can do any more damage." The officer nodded. "I've been working on something. There are some people I trust. A few colleagues who still believe in doing things the right way. They're ready to help, but it won't be easy." The chief stopped walking, his mind racing. "You've got people in place?" The officer smiled faintly. "I wouldn't call them a network, but yes, a few good men and women who've seen what's going on and aren't afraid to take action." "Good," the chief said, feeling a spark of hope. "Let's use them. We don't have time to waste." They reached a small, inconspicuous building at the edge of town. The officer stopped in front of it and turned to the chief. "This is where we need to go. Inside we'll have some privacy. We'll make our move from there." The chief nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. It was time to take control, to fight back not just for himself but for the truth. As they entered the building, the dim light inside created a sense of urgency. The place was quiet, but the tension was palpable. The chief could feel it in the air. They weren't alone, but they weren't quite sure who was on their side yet. They walked down a narrow corridor and the officer stopped in front of a door. He knocked 3 times, then stepped back. The door creaked open, and the chief saw a familiar face on the other side. A woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She stepped aside to let them in. "Glad you made it," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "We've been waiting for you." The chief stepped into the room, his heart beating faster now. There were a few others inside, 2 men and another woman. They were all sitting at a small table, laptops open, papers scattered around. It was clear they had been working on something important. "Is everything in place?" the chief asked. The woman who had greeted them nodded. "We've got the evidence. It's not everything, but it's enough to start. We've been gathering information on the officers involved, and we've got some serious leads. But it's not going to be easy to make it public. These people have too many connections." The chief took a seat at the table, his mind racing. "We need to expose them. We need to make sure everyone knows what they're doing. We can't let them cover it up." One of the men, a tall figure with a serious expression, spoke up. "We've got some intel that the people behind this are higher up than we thought. This isn't just about a couple of rogue officers. This goes deeper, but we're ready to take it on." The chief's mind reeled. He had known the system was flawed, but hearing it like this, knowing that there were people at the top pulling the strings, it hit harder than he expected. This wasn't just about one bad situation. This was systemic corruption that could be reaching into every corner of the department. "We can't back down," the chief said firmly. "We take this to the highest level. We expose everything. But we need to move fast. If we wait too long, it'll be buried. We've seen how these things go." The woman who had greeted them nodded again. "We're on the same page. We've already started reaching out to trusted reporters. We have a couple of allies in the press who are willing to go public with what we've got. But it has to be done carefully. If we go too public too soon, they'll bury it and we'll have nothing." There was a long silence as everyone absorbed the weight of the plan. The chief could feel the urgency, but he also understood the risks. They were walking a fine line, and one wrong move could mean disaster. The officer who had helped the chief earlier spoke again. "We've got a few hours before the next shift changes. If we move quickly, we can get the documents out to the press and get the ball rolling." The chief nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Let's do it. We move now. The sooner we act, the sooner we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Everyone in the room seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. They all knew the risks. But they also knew that if they didn't act, they would be complicit in letting this corruption continue unchecked. As they gathered their things and prepared to move out, the chief couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was a battle he had never expected to fight, but it was a fight he was willing to see through. The truth had to come out no matter what the cost. They left the building quietly, moving swiftly through the streets, knowing that time was running out. The plan was set into motion. There was no turning back now. The chief felt a calm resolve settle over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had hope. This fight wasn't over, but it was just beginning.